I heard her whispered words through the baby monitor crystal clear. "You're just a burden, Margaret. I wish David would finally see that and stop making excuses for you." What she didn't realize was that David had just walked into the nursery and heard every cruel word through that same monitor. 2 hours later, she was packing her bags while sobbing about how she never meant it. But by then, David had already made his decision. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 68 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, where the rain matches my mood most days now. For the past 3 years, I've been living in the basement apartment of my son David's house, helping raise my grandson little Tommy, while my daughter-in-law Stephanie pursued her master's degree in marketing. I thought I was being helpful, I thought I was contributing to the family. I had no idea that the woman I'd been supporting and caring for saw me as nothing more than an unwelcome guest who'd overstayed her welcome. The story of how I ended up living in their basement begins 4 years ago, when my husband Frank passed away from a sudden heart attack. We'd been married for 42 years, and losing him felt like losing half of myself. Frank and I had lived in the same house in Seattle for 30 years, raising David there, watching him grow from a curious little boy into the successful software engineer he became. After Frank died, that house felt impossibly empty and too expensive for me to maintain on my teacher's pension alone. David had always been a good son. Even as an adult, he called me twice a week, visited for holidays, and made sure I felt included in his life. When he married Stephanie 5 years ago, I was genuinely happy for him. She was beautiful, ambitious, and seemed to make him laugh in ways I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. At their wedding, she hugged me tightly and told me she was so grateful to finally have a mother figure in her life, since her own parents had died in a car accident when she was in college. I believed her sincerity then. I wanted to believe it. After Frank's funeral, David approached me with what seemed like the perfect solution to both our problems. He and Stephanie had just bought a large house in Portland, with a separate basement apartment. They'd been thinking about renting it out for extra income, but David suggested I move in instead. I could help with childcare when they had children, Stephanie could focus on finishing her education, and I wouldn't have to face the grief of living alone in the house Frank and I had shared. The basement apartment was actually quite nice. It had its own entrance, a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a sitting area with a window that looked out into their backyard. David had insisted I shouldn't pay rent, since I'd be helping with household responsibilities. But I gave him $500 a month anyway because I wanted to contribute something. I also used my savings to help furnish the main house and bought groceries for the family every week. For the first year, everything seemed wonderful. Stephanie was pregnant with Tommy, and she genuinely appeared to appreciate having me around. I'd cook dinner most nights, do laundry, keep the house clean, and run errands while she rested, and David worked long hours at his tech company. When she had morning sickness, I'd bring her ginger tea and crackers. When she couldn't sleep because of back pain, I'd stay up with her watching late-night television. Tommy was born on a rainy Tuesday in March, and I fell in love with that little boy the moment I held him. David looked so proud and happy, and Stephanie seemed genuinely grateful for my help during those first exhausting weeks of new parenthood. I was the one who got up for the 2 a.m. feedings so they could sleep. I changed diapers, did endless loads of baby laundry, and sang lullabies I remembered from when David was small. Stephanie would often tell her friends how lucky she was to have built-in childcare and help, how her mother-in-law was such a blessing. I felt needed and appreciated in ways I hadn't experienced since Frank died. For the first time since losing my husband, I felt like I belonged somewhere again. But slowly things began to change. It started small. Stephanie would make comments about my cooking being too salty, or suggest that I was holding Tommy too much and spoiling him. She'd rearrange things I'd cleaned or organized, explaining that she preferred them done differently. When I'd offer suggestions about baby care based on my experience raising David, she'd smile tightly and say modern parenting was different from how things were done 30 years ago. I tried not to take it personally. New mothers can be particular about their routines, and I remembered feeling protective of my own methods when David was born. I figured once Stephanie felt more confident as a parent, she'd relax and things would improve between us. Instead, they got worse. By the time Tommy turned 1, Stephanie had started her graduate program and was spending most evenings either in class or studying. I was essentially the primary caregiver for Tommy during those hours, feeding him dinner, giving him baths, reading bedtime stories, and putting him to sleep. I loved every minute of it, but I began to notice that Stephanie seemed increasingly irritated by my presence rather than grateful for my help. She'd walk into the kitchen while I was making lunch for Tommy and sigh loudly, muttering about not being able to find anything in her own kitchen because I'd moved things around. If I was playing with Tommy in the living room when she came home, she'd immediately redirect his attention to herself and suggest I probably had things to do downstairs. When David praised something I'd cooked or mentioned how helpful I'd been with Tommy, Stephanie would change the subject quickly, or make a comment about how she'd handle things differently once she had more time. The criticism became more frequent and less subtle. My cleaning wasn't thorough enough. My cooking was too old-fashioned for Tommy's developing palate. I was too indulgent with him and not establishing proper boundaries. I dressed him in clothes that were too warm or not warm enough. I let him watch too much television or not enough educational programming. Every day brought a new correction, a new suggestion for how I could do things better, a new reminder that this was her house and her child even though I was the one caring for him most of the time. I started walking on eggshells, second-guessing every decision, asking permission for things I'd been doing independently for months. David seemed oblivious to the shift in dynamics. He was working 60-hour weeks trying to advance in his company, and when he was home, Stephanie was sweet and appreciative in front of him. She'd thank me publicly for my help while privately undermining my confidence and criticizing my methods. It was a careful balance that kept David from seeing what was really happening. The breaking point came on what should have been a happy family occasion. Tommy was turning 2, and we'd planned a small birthday party in the backyard. I'd spent days preparing his favorite foods, decorating the space, and organizing games for the few toddler friends Stephanie had invited from his playgroup. I'd also bought Tommy's main gift, a wooden train set that I'd been saving up for because I knew he loved trains. On the morning of the party, I was in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on Tommy's cake when Stephanie walked in with a bag from an expensive toy store. She pulled out an elaborate electronic train set that probably cost 3 times what I'd spent on the wooden one. "I got Tommy's real present," she announced, not even glancing at the carefully wrapped wooden train set I'd left on the counter. "That little wooden thing you got him is cute, but this is what he'll actually want to play with." I felt like I'd been slapped. I'd spent weeks researching the best educational toys for 2-year-olds, and had chosen the wooden set specifically because it would grow with him and encourage creativity. But more than that, it was the dismissive way she'd called it a little wooden thing, as if my thoughtfulness and financial sacrifice were insignificant. During the party, Tommy was excited about both gifts, but Stephanie made sure all the other parents saw him playing with her electronic train, while the wooden set sat forgotten in the corner. When people complimented the beautiful party setup, she thanked them graciously without mentioning that I'd done all the preparation work. When they asked about the
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
delicious food, she just smiled and accepted the praise. That evening, after the guests had gone home and Tommy was asleep, I overheard Stephanie talking on the phone with someone, probably her sister in California. She was in the living room, and I was cleaning up in the kitchen, but her voice carried clearly through the open doorway. "The party went really well," she was saying, "though I had to redo half of Margaret's decorating because it looked so dated. And you should have seen the gift she got Tommy, some old-fashioned wooden train that probably came from a garage sale. Thank goodness I bought something decent for him to actually play with." I stood at the kitchen sink with tears streaming down my face, scrubbing the same plate over and over while listening to her criticize my efforts to someone hundreds of miles away. This was what she really thought of me, of my contributions, of the love and care I poured into her family every single day. But I didn't say anything. I was afraid that confronting her would create problems between her and David, and I couldn't bear the thought of being responsible for tension in their marriage. I was also terrified that if I made waves, I'd lose my place in Tommy's life. Where would I go? How would I rebuild a life at 68 years old? So I stayed quiet, swallowed my hurt, and tried harder to please her. The situation continued to deteriorate over the following months. Stephanie's comments became sharper and more frequent. She'd wait until David left for work, then spend the morning pointing out everything I'd done wrong the day before. The way I'd folded Tommy's clothes wasn't right. The educational activities I'd planned for him were either too advanced or too babyish. The meals I prepared were too complicated or too simple. She started making unilateral decisions about Tommy's care, and then acting annoyed when I wasn't immediately aware of the changes. She'd sign him up for new classes or cancel existing ones without telling me, then act frustrated when I showed up at the wrong place or wrong time. She'd change his nap schedule or meal preferences and then criticize me for not knowing about the modifications. The worst part was how she'd become sweet and grateful again whenever David was around. She'd put her arm around my shoulders and tell him how wonderful it was to have such a helpful mother-in-law. She'd praise my cooking in front of him and mention how much Tommy loved spending time with Grandma Margaret. David would beam with pride at how well his wife and mother got along, completely unaware of the daily emotional warfare happening under his nose. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. The woman who criticized everything I did during the day would transform into someone warm and appreciative the moment her husband walked through the door. I started questioning my own perception of events, wondering if I was being too sensitive or misinterpreting her behavior. The isolation was crushing. I'd moved away from my friends in Seattle to be closer to David's family, and I hadn't built new friendships in Portland because I was so busy helping with Tommy and the household. My entire world revolved around people who seemed increasingly unwilling to have me in theirs. Things reached a new low during Tommy's second Christmas. I'd been looking forward to the holiday for weeks, planning special activities and buying thoughtful gifts for everyone. I'd knitted a beautiful sweater for Tommy and found a vintage cookbook I thought Stephanie might enjoy since she'd mentioned wanting to expand her cooking skills. On Christmas morning, Tommy loved his sweater and wore it proudly while opening his other presents. But when Stephanie unwrapped the cookbook, she barely glanced at it before setting it aside with a polite but cold, "Thank you." Later, while I was doing dishes after Christmas brunch, I heard her on the phone again, this time complaining to someone about receiving random old cookbooks as gifts. I mean, I appreciate the thought, she was saying, but it's like she doesn't even know me. Who gives someone a cookbook about casseroles from the 1970s? I'm trying to lose the baby weight, not learn how to make tuna noodle bake. I'd spent hours in antique shops looking for that cookbook because I'd remembered her mentioning that she'd grown up eating her grandmother's casseroles and missed that comfort food. I thought I was being thoughtful and personal. Instead, I was being mocked for my efforts to connect with her. By Tommy's third birthday, I'd become a ghost in the house I helped maintain. I still did the cooking, cleaning, and childcare, but Stephanie had stopped acknowledging my contributions entirely. She'd walk past me in the hallway without making eye contact. She'd ask David to tell me things instead of speaking to me directly. When Tommy would run to hug me when I picked him up from preschool, she'd immediately call him to her side and find some urgent task that required his attention. I felt invisible, unwanted, and completely disposable. But I stayed because I loved Tommy desperately, and I was terrified that leaving would mean losing him forever. I also had nowhere else to go. My savings had dwindled over the years from buying groceries, gifts, and household items for David's family. I couldn't afford to rent my own apartment in Portland's expensive housing market, and the thought of moving back to Seattle alone felt overwhelming, so I endured the daily humiliations, the constant criticism, and the feeling of being treated like unwelcome hired help in my own son's home. I told myself that Stephanie was just stressed from school and would warm up to me again once she graduated and felt more settled. I convinced myself that David's occasional expressions of gratitude meant that at least he appreciated my presence, even if his wife didn't. I had no idea that things were about to get much worse before they got better. The incident that finally opened David's eyes to what was really happening occurred on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Tommy was napping and Stephanie thought she was alone in the house with me. David had left work early for a dental appointment but decided to stop home first to pick up some documents he'd forgotten. Neither Stephanie nor I knew he'd come back. I was in the kitchen preparing Tommy's afternoon snack when Stephanie came downstairs from her home office where she'd been working on a research paper. She seemed particularly agitated that day. Her professors had been demanding more revisions on her thesis than she'd expected, and she was stressed about graduation deadlines. But instead of directing her frustration at the appropriate sources, she decided to take it out on me. "Margaret," she said, her voice sharp with irritation, "I need to talk to you about something." I set down the apple I'd been slicing and turned to face her, already bracing myself for whatever complaint was coming. David and I have been talking, she began, which I immediately knew was a lie because David had been nothing but kind and appreciative toward me recently. And we think it might be time for you to start thinking about other living arrangements. My heart sank into my stomach. Other living arrangements? I don't understand. You've been so helpful with Tommy, she continued in a tone that managed to sound both patronizing and dismissive. But he's getting older now and doesn't need as much hands-on care. And with me graduating soon, I'll have more time to focus on being a full-time mom. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Are you asking me to move out? We're not asking you to leave immediately, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. But maybe you could start looking for a nice senior community or something. Somewhere you could make friends with people your own age. The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. She was discussing my future as if I were an aging pet that had become inconvenient, rather than a family member who'd spent 3 years caring for their child and maintaining their household. Stephanie, I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. I thought I was helping. I thought you needed my support. Well, yes, she admitted reluctantly, but Tommy's getting more independent, and honestly, sometimes I feel like I can't parent my own child because you're always there doing everything for him. This was rich coming from someone who spent most evenings studying while I handled bedtime routines, but I didn't point that out. What does David think about this? I asked, hoping my son had more sense than his wife was displaying. Stephanie's expression shifted slightly, and I caught a flicker of something that looked like guilt. David agrees that you've done so much for us, but he also wants what's best for everyone. I knew she was lying. David had been nothing but grateful for my presence, and just the week before, he'd told me how much he appreciated everything I did for their family. But I also knew that arguing with Stephanie would only make things worse. I see, I said quietly. When would you want me to start looking? Well, maybe you could start researching places this month. There's no rush, but it would be good to have a plan. I nodded numbly and turned back to preparing Tommy's snack, trying to hold back tears until she left the room. But Stephanie wasn't finished with her cruelty. You know, Margaret, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that she probably thought sounded confidential but actually sounded venomous. I hope you understand this isn't personal. It's just that you're getting older, and sometimes you're more of a burden than a help. I wish David would see that and stop making excuses for you. Those words hit me like a knife to the chest. After 3 years of caring for her child, maintaining her home, and supporting her education, she saw me as nothing more than a burden, an inconvenience, an aging relative who'd outlived her usefulness. I stood at the counter with my back to her, tears streaming down my face while I mechanically continued slicing apples. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't even turn around to face her. The sheer heartlessness of what she'd just said left me completely speechless. I'm going back upstairs to work, she announced, as if she'd just discussed the weather instead of casually destroying my sense of belonging and self-worth. Can you make sure Tommy's quiet when he wakes up? I have a conference call at 3. She walked away, leaving me standing in the kitchen feeling like my world had just collapsed around me. I'd known she didn't appreciate me, but I'd never realized she actively resented my presence. I'd thought I was contributing to their family, helping them succeed, making their lives easier. Instead, I was just a burden they tolerated, because David felt obligated to care for his aging mother. What I didn't know was that David had walked into the house through the front door just as Stephanie was delivering her cruel assessment of my worth. He'd heard his wife's whispered words through the baby monitor that we kept in the kitchen so we could hear Tommy during his naps. The monitor transmitted sound both ways, and David had been standing in the nursery checking on his sleeping son when Stephanie's voice came through crystal clear. You're getting older, and sometimes you're more of a burden than a help. I wish David would see that and stop making excuses for you. David told me later that hearing those words felt like discovering a stranger living in his house. This wasn't the woman he'd married, the woman who'd claimed to be grateful for my help, the woman who'd told him repeatedly how wonderful it was to have me around. This was someone cold and calculating, someone who could smile at me over dinner while secretly resenting every breath I took in her presence. He stood in Tommy's room for several minutes, listening to me crying quietly in the kitchen below while his son slept peacefully, unaware that his world was about to change dramatically. David later told me that in that moment he realized he had to choose between his wife's convenience and his mother's dignity, and there was no question which mattered more. I didn't know about any of this as I stood in the kitchen trying to compose myself before Tommy woke up. I wiped my tears, finished preparing his snack, and tried to figure out how I was going to tell David that his wife wanted me gone. I was dreading that conversation, afraid that he'd side with Stephanie and ask me to leave, but also afraid that telling him the truth might cause problems in their marriage. 20 minutes later, I heard David's car in the driveway. I was surprised because he shouldn't have been home for hours, but I assumed he'd forgotten something for his dentist appointment. I heard the front door open and close, then his footsteps heading upstairs toward the bedroom he shared with Stephanie. What happened next, I learned about much later from David himself. He'd gone upstairs and found Stephanie at her desk, headphones on, completely absorbed in her research. He'd tapped her shoulder to get her attention, and when she turned around, he was looking at her with an expression she'd apparently never seen before. "We need to talk," he'd said quietly. "About what?" "I'm really busy right now, David. Can it wait until tonight?" "No, it can't wait. I heard what you said to my mother." Stephanie had gone pale. "What do you mean? I haven't talked to your mother today." "I heard you tell her she was a burden. I heard you say you wished I would stop making excuses for her." David told me that Stephanie had tried to deny it at first, then tried to explain that she'd been stressed about school, then finally tried to justify her words by listing all the ways my presence supposedly interfered with their family life. But David wasn't interested in her excuses. "My mother has spent 3 years caring for our son while you finished school," he'd said. "She's cleaned our house, cooked our meals, and loved Tommy like her own child. She pays rent she doesn't owe, and buys groceries she shouldn't have to pay for. And you think she's a burden?" "David, you don't understand how it feels to have someone else always there, always interfering with how I want to raise my child." "Interfering? She raised me, Stephanie. She knows what she's doing. And Tommy adores her." The argument had escalated from there, with Stephanie defending her right to want privacy in her own home, and David pointing out that it was his home too, and his mother was welcome in it. But the real turning point had come when Stephanie made a critical mistake. "Fine," she'd said, her voice rising with frustration. "If you want to choose your mother over your wife, go ahead. But I won't live in a house where I can't be the primary parent to my own child." "Primary parent?" David had repeated. "You spend more time studying than you do with Tommy. My mother is more of a primary parent to him than you are." "That's exactly the problem, David. Don't you see? She's taken over my role. She's made herself indispensable so you can't ask her to leave. It's manipulative." That accusation had been the final straw. David told me later that hearing Stephanie characterize my love and care for Tommy as manipulation was the moment he realized their marriage might not be salvageable. "Pack a bag," he'd told her quietly. "What?" "Pack a bag and go stay with your sister for a while. I need time to think about this." "David, you're being ridiculous. I'm not leaving my own house." "Yes, you are. Because right now I don't trust myself to have a civil conversation with you, and I don't want Tommy to see his parents fighting." Stephanie had tried to argue, tried to turn the situation back around on me, tried to make David see her perspective. But he'd been unmoved. He'd given her an hour to pack while he went downstairs to talk to me. I was still in the kitchen when he came down, and I could tell immediately that something significant had happened. His face was red, his jaw was clenched, and he looked angrier than I'd seen him since he was a teenager. "Mom," he'd said, sitting down at the kitchen table and motioning for me to join him. "I heard what Stephanie said to you." My heart sank. This was it. This was when he'd ask me to leave, to keep peace in his marriage. "David, I don't want to cause problems between you and Stephanie." I'd started, but he'd held up his hand to stop me. "The only person causing problems is Stephanie," he'd said firmly. "What she said to you was cruel and completely unacceptable. You're not a burden, Mom. You're family. This is your home, and I'm ashamed of my wife for making you feel unwelcome in it." I'd started crying then, not from sadness but from relief. For 3 years, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was imagining the hostility and resentment. Having David validate my experience felt like being thrown a life preserver when I was drowning. I've asked Stephanie to leave for a while, he'd continued. I need time to think about our marriage, and I need her to understand that treating you with disrespect is not acceptable. David, I don't want to be responsible for breaking up your marriage. Mom, you're not responsible for anything. Stephanie's attitude toward you is her choice, and it's a choice I can't live with. We'd talked for over an hour that afternoon while Tommy napped. David had apologized repeatedly for not seeing what was happening, for allowing his wife to make me feel unwelcome in his home. He'd asked me to tell him about all the Rupperwith incidents I'd been keeping to myself, and as I recounted months of small cruelties and casual dismissals, I could see his anger growing. I can't believe I didn't see this, he'd said. I can't believe I let her treat you this way. She was always different when you were around, I'd explained. I don't think you could have known. But I should have paid more attention. I should have noticed that you seemed unhappy. When Stephanie had come downstairs with her suitcase an hour later, her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was still defiant. David, please don't do this, she'd pleaded. We can work this out. I'll try to be more appreciative of your mother's help. Stephanie, this isn't about appreciation. This is about basic human decency. My mother has sacrificed for our family, and you've treated her like an inconvenience. I was just having a bad day. I didn't mean what I said. Yes, you did. And that's the problem. She'd turned to me then, and for a moment I thought she might actually apologize. Instead, she'd said, Margaret, I hope you're happy. You've gotten what you wanted. The accusation had been so unfair, so completely wrong that I'd been speechless. I hadn't wanted any of this. I'd wanted to be part of their family, to contribute positively to their lives, to watch my grandson grow up surrounded by people who loved him. The last thing I'd wanted was to see David's marriage fall apart. But David had stepped between us before I could respond. Don't blame my mother for the consequences of your own actions, he'd said coldly. You did this, Stephanie. You chose to be cruel to someone who's done nothing but help us. She'd left after that, and the house had felt strange and quiet without her presence. Tommy had woken up confused about where his mommy had gone, and David had struggled to explain that she was visiting Aunt Lisa for a few days. That night, after Tommy was in bed, David and I had sat in the living room talking about what came next. He'd been honest about his doubts regarding his marriage, about whether someone who could be so callous toward me could be trusted to treat Tommy with kindness as he grew older. What if she decides he's a burden someday too, he'd asked. What if she gets tired of the responsibilities of parenting the way she got tired of appreciating your help? I hadn't known how to answer that. I'd seen glimpses of Stephanie's capacity for coldness, but I'd never imagined it extending to her own child. Over the following weeks, David and Stephanie had tried marriage counseling, but it hadn't gone well. Stephanie had maintained that her feelings were valid, that wanting privacy in her own home was reasonable, and that I'd overstepped boundaries by being too involved with Tommy's care. The counselor had pointed out that I was providing free childcare and contributing financially to the household, but Stephanie had remained convinced that my presence was an imposition rather than a gift. The final session had ended with Stephanie demanding that David choose between his wife and his mother, and David responding that he'd already made that choice when he heard her call me a burden. 3 months later, Stephanie had filed for divorce. She'd moved to California to be closer to her sister and had started a new job in marketing. She'd taken Tommy for a 2-week visit in July, and when she'd brought him back, he'd been quiet and clingy for days afterward. Mommy said you might move away too, he'd confided to me one evening while I was reading him bedtime stories. She said sometimes grandmas have to live in special places with other old people. My heart had broken hearing that Stephanie was poisoning my relationship with Tommy even from hundreds of miles away, but I'd reassured him that I wasn't going anywhere unless he and his daddy wanted me to leave. We don't want you to leave, Grandma, he'd said firmly. Daddy said you live here because we're family. Now, a year later, our life has settled into a new normal. David has primary custody of Tommy, with Stephanie visiting every other month and taking him for holidays. Tommy seems happier and more secure with a predictable routine, and David has learned to balance work with single parenting, though I still help whenever he needs it. I've made friends at the community center, joined a book club, and started volunteering at Tommy's school. For the first time in years, I feel valued and respected by the people around me. I'm no longer walking on eggshells or second-guessing every interaction. David has started dating someone new, a kindergarten teacher named Rachel, who treats me with warmth and genuine interest. She asks for my advice about lesson plans and includes me in family activities without making me feel like an outsider. Tommy adores her, and she's never once made me feel like my presence is an intrusion. The weeks following Stephanie's departure were unlike anything I'd experienced since Frank's death. The house felt different without her constant presence, but not empty. Lighter somehow. More peaceful. I'd grown so accustomed to walking on eggshells that it took me several days to realize I could move through the rooms without bracing myself for criticism or complaints. David threw himself into work during those first few days, staying late at the office and coming home exhausted. I could see the strain on his face, the way he'd sit at the dinner table staring at his food without really eating it. He was processing not just the end of his marriage, but the realization that the woman he'd loved had been capable of such calculated cruelty towards someone he cared about. Tommy was the one who helped us both navigate those difficult early days. At 3 years old, he was too young to understand the complexities of what had happened, but he sensed the change in our household dynamics. Without Stephanie there to redirect his attention away from me, he became even more affectionate and clingy, as if making up for lost time. He started asking me to read extra bedtime stories, to sit with him during his afternoon snacks, to help him build elaborate block towers in the living room. These were all activities Stephanie had previously interrupted or discouraged, claiming they interfered with his development of independence. Now, without her disapproving presence, Tommy and I could enjoy each other's company without constantly looking over our shoulders. David noticed the change in Tommy's behavior immediately. His son was more relaxed, more talkative, more willing to engage in creative play. The rigid structure that Stephanie had insisted upon, specific meal times, limited television, carefully scheduled activities, gave way to a more natural rhythm that followed Tommy's actual needs and interests, rather than some theoretical parenting manual. One evening, about a week after Stephanie had left, David found me in the kitchen preparing Tommy's dinner, while Tommy sat at the counter, chattering about his day at preschool. David stood in the doorway watching us for several minutes, and when I finally noticed him, there were tears in his eyes. "I never realized how much she controlled his interactions with you," he said quietly after Tommy had run off to play with his toys. "Look how happy he is." I'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to voice it. Stephanie had created an environment where even a 3-year-old felt the tension, where natural expressions of affection between grandmother and grandson were somehow discouraged or redirected. Without that constant interference, Tommy was free to be himself, and himself included a deep, uncomplicated love for his grandma Margaret. The first real test of our new dynamic came when Stephanie called to speak with Tommy. It was a Tuesday evening, about 10 days after she'd left. David answered the phone in the living room while I was giving Tommy his bath upstairs. Even through the closed bathroom door, I could hear David's voice getting tenser as the conversation progressed. When Tommy was clean and in his pajamas, David came upstairs with the cordless phone, his expression carefully neutral. "Tommy, Mommy wants to talk to you," he said, handing the phone to his son. Tommy took the phone eagerly, excited to hear from his mother. But as the conversation progressed, his expression began to change. His initial enthusiasm faded, replaced by confusion, and then something that looked like distress. "I don't know, Mommy," he was saying. "Grandma Margaret isn't mean to me. She makes good pancakes and reads me stories." There was a long pause while Stephanie spoke on the other end. "But I like living with Grandma," Tommy said, his voice getting smaller. "She's not going anywhere, is she, Daddy?" David took the phone back after a few more minutes, his jaw clenched with barely contained anger. The conversation that followed was brief and heated, conducted in whispers that Tommy couldn't hear, but that left no doubt about David's feelings regarding his estranged wife's attempt to manipulate their son. After David hung up, Tommy crawled into my lap on the couch and buried his face against my shoulder. "Mommy said you might have to move to a old people place," he whispered. "She said sometimes grandmas can't live with their families." My heart broke hearing those words. Even from California, even after being asked to leave, Stephanie was still trying to poison Tommy's relationship with me. She was planting seeds of insecurity in a 3-year-old's mind, making him worry about losing another important person in his life. "Tommy," I said gently, stroking his hair, "I'm not going anywhere unless you and Daddy want me to leave. Do you want me to leave?" He shook his head vigorously against my shoulder. "No, Grandma. I want you to stay forever." "Then I'll stay forever," I promised him, hoping it was a promise I could keep. David had been listening to our conversation from across the room, and when Tommy finally fell asleep in my arms, David carefully carried him upstairs to bed. When he came back down, he was angrier than I'd seen him since the day he'd heard Stephanie's cruel words through the baby monitor. "She's trying to convince him that you're temporary," he said, pacing around the living room. "She's making him insecure about the one stable relationship he has right now." "David, maybe you should consider what she's asking," I said carefully. "If there's any chance you two might reconcile, my being here could be an obstacle." "Mom, there is no chance of reconciliation. Not after this. Not after hearing her try to manipulate Tommy into thinking you don't belong here." He sat down heavily in his armchair and put his head in his hands. "I keep thinking about all the times she must have said things to him when I wasn't around. All the ways she might have been subtly undermining your relationship with him. I'd been wondering the same thing. How many times had Stephanie made casual comments about my age, my methods, my place in their household? How many times had she suggested to Tommy that having me around was unusual or temporary? The thought made me sick to my stomach. The next morning, David made a decision that surprised me. He called his office and took a personal day, then spent the morning on the phone with a family law attorney. When he hung up from that call, he came to find me in the garden where I was helping Tommy plant seeds in the raised beds David had built the previous spring. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me," he said, sitting down on the garden bench while Tommy continued digging in the soil with his small shovel. "Of course," I replied, though his serious tone made me nervous. "If Stephanie and I get divorced, would you be willing to testify about how she treated you? About the things she said?" I was quiet for a long moment, watching Tommy carefully pat soil over the seeds we'd planted. "David, I don't want to be the reason your marriage ends. I don't want Tommy to grow up knowing I was involved in his parents' divorce." "You wouldn't be the reason, Mom. Her behavior is the reason. But the attorney says that establishing a pattern of emotional abuse toward family members could be relevant to custody decisions." The idea of testifying against Stephanie in court made me deeply uncomfortable, but I also understood David's concern. If Stephanie was willing to be cruel to me and manipulative toward Tommy, what other behaviors might emerge as he grew older? "What exactly would I need to testify about?" I asked. "Just the truth. The things she said to you, the way she treated you, the conversation I overheard through the monitor." I looked at Tommy, happily absorbed in his gardening project, completely unaware that his future was being decided by the adults around him. "If you think it would help protect Tommy, then yes, I'll do it." David squeezed my hand gratefully. "The attorney also wants to know if you'd be willing to continue living here and helping with childcare if I get primary custody. Stability and consistent caregiving are important factors in custody decisions." "Of course I would. This is my home now, David. Tommy is my grandson. I'm not going anywhere." The divorce proceedings began in earnest a month later. Stephanie hired her own attorney and initially fought for joint custody, claiming that David was being influenced by his controlling mother who had driven a wedge between them. The irony of being called controlling by someone who had tried to dictate every aspect of my daily life wasn't lost on me, but it still stung to see those words in legal documents. The custody evaluation process was exhaustive and emotionally draining. Social workers visited our home multiple times, observing how Tommy interacted with both David and me. They interviewed Tommy's preschool teachers, our neighbors, and David's coworkers. They wanted to understand the family dynamics, the stability of our household, and Tommy's emotional well-being. During one of these visits, the social worker asked Tommy to draw a picture of his family. Without hesitation, he drew 3 stick figures standing in front of a house: a tall figure labeled Daddy, a medium figure labeled Grandma, and a small figure labeled Me. When asked about his mother, he added a 4th figure standing far to the side, separated from the group. "That's Mommy," he explained to the social worker. "She lives far away now, but she calls sometimes." The social worker made notes about Tommy's representation of his family structure, about which relationships he saw as central to his daily life. It was clear that in Tommy's mind, his core family unit consisted of his father, his grandmother, and himself. When it came time for my testimony, I was more nervous than I'd expected. The courtroom felt cold and formal, nothing like the warm kitchen where Stephanie had delivered her cruel assessment of my worth. But as I sat in the witness chair and looked at David's encouraging face, I found the strength to tell my story honestly and completely. I testified about the gradual change in Stephanie's behavior toward me, the increasing criticism and dismissiveness, the way she'd treat me like hired help while David was at work but transform into a grateful daughter-in-law when he was home. I described specific incidents: the birthday party where my gift was dismissed, the Christmas morning where my thoughtful present was mocked, the baseball game where I was asked to sit alone. The hardest part was recounting the conversation David had overheard through the baby monitor. Speaking those words aloud in court, hearing myself repeat Stephanie's assessment of me as a burden, brought back all the hurt and humiliation I'd felt that afternoon. But I also felt a sense of validation, finally having my experience acknowledged and taken seriously by people in positions of authority. Stephanie's attorney tried to paint me as an interfering mother-in-law who had overstepped boundaries and made it difficult for a young mother to establish her own parenting style. They suggested that my presence in the home had been intrusive and that Stephanie's frustration was understandable. But David's attorney was prepared for this line of argument. He presented evidence of my financial contributions to the household, documentation of the childcare I'd provided while Stephanie attended school, testimonials from Tommy's teachers about his well-being and stability. He painted a picture of a grandmother who had sacrificed her own independence to support her son's family, only to be treated with contempt and cruelty. The turning point in the custody hearing came when Tommy's preschool teacher testified. Mrs. Rodriguez had worked with 3-year-olds for over 20 years, and she had strong opinions about Tommy's family situation. "Tommy is one of the most secure and happy children in my class," she testified. "He talks about his grandmother constantly, with obvious love and affection. When he draws pictures of his family, when he talks about his home life, when he needs comfort during the day, he mentions his grandmother as often as he mentions his father." She went on to describe how Tommy had seemed more anxious during the period when Stephanie was still living in the house, how he'd become more relaxed and expressive after she left. "In my professional opinion," Mrs. Rodriguez concluded, "removing this child from his grandmother's care would be traumatic for him. She's clearly a primary attachment figure in his life." The judge awarded David primary custody, with Stephanie receiving supervised visitation rights until she could demonstrate emotional stability and appropriate behavior toward all members of Tommy's family, including me. The judge noted that a parent who could be emotionally abusive toward a family member was a concern for the child's emotional safety as well. Stephanie was furious with the decision. She blamed me for poisoning David against her, for manipulating the court system, for stealing her son away from her. The accusations were painful because they were so far from the truth. I'd never wanted to be involved in their marital problems, never wanted to be the cause of Tommy growing up in a broken home. But I also couldn't deny the relief I felt, knowing that Tommy would be safe from the kind of emotional manipulation I'd experienced. Children are incredibly perceptive, and I'd seen how Tommy had picked up on the tension in the household even before Stephanie left. At least now he could grow up in an environment where love wasn't conditional on perfect behavior, where family members treated each other with respect and kindness. The months following the custody decision were a period of adjustment for all of us. David had to learn to balance single parenthood with his demanding job, and I had to learn to be more than just a helpful grandmother. I was now one of Tommy's primary caregivers, someone he depended on for emotional security and daily stability. Tommy thrived in our new family structure. Without the constant tension that had characterized his early years, he became more confident, more creative, more willing to express his opinions and preferences. He started asking more questions, telling longer stories, engaging more deeply with the books we read together. I also began to flourish in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time since Frank's death, I felt truly needed and appreciated. David never took my contributions for granted, and he made sure Tommy understood how lucky they were to have me in their lives. I wasn't walking on eggshells anymore, wasn't second-guessing every interaction, wasn't waiting for criticism that never came. David also started therapy during this period, working through his feelings about the marriage and his guilt about not recognizing Stephanie's behavior toward me sooner. His therapist helped him understand that emotional abuse often happens in private, that abusers are skilled at presenting different faces to different people, and that his failure to see what was happening didn't make him responsible for Stephanie's choices. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," he told me one evening as we sat in the living room after Tommy's bedtime. "All the times you seemed quieter or more withdrawn. All the times she'd make little comments about your cooking or your methods with Tommy." "David, she was very careful to hide her true feelings when you were around," I reminded him. "That's not your fault. But you're my mother. I should have been more protective of you. I should have paid closer attention to how you were being treated in my own house." I understood his guilt, but I also knew it wasn't productive. What matters is that when you did see the truth, you acted on it immediately. You chose to protect me even when it meant ending your marriage. That takes courage. As we settled into our new routine, I began to realize how much of myself I'd lost during those difficult years with Stephanie. I'd become so focused on avoiding conflict, on trying to please someone who couldn't be pleased, that I'd stopped pursuing my own interests and friendships. I'd made myself smaller and quieter, taking up less space, in hopes that Stephanie would find me less objectionable. Now, with that constant pressure removed, I started reclaiming parts of my identity that had been dormant. I joined a book club at the local library, started volunteering at Tommy's preschool, and even took a watercolor painting class at the community center. For the first time in years, I had conversations that weren't about childcare or household management. I had interests and activities that were mine alone. Tommy loved hearing about my various activities. He'd ask me to show him my paintings, to tell him about the books I was reading, to describe the other children I worked with at his school. Far from being jealous of my time away from home, he seemed proud that his grandmother had her own life and interests. Stephanie's visits during this period were challenging for all of us. The court had ordered supervised visitation, which meant that either David or a court-appointed supervisor had to be present during her time with Tommy. The visits took place at a neutral location, usually a family services center with play areas and observation rooms. Tommy was always excited to see his mother at first, but these visits often left him confused and emotional. Stephanie would ask him leading questions about his home life, trying to get him to express dissatisfaction with living with his father and grandmother. She'd make comments about how things would be different when she had her own place for him to visit, implying that his current living situation was temporary. After each visit, Tommy would come home clingy and insecure, needing extra reassurance that I wasn't going anywhere, that David wasn't going to leave him, that his family was stable and permanent. It broke my heart to see a 4-year-old grappling with these adult concerns, trying to process loyalty conflicts that no child should have to navigate. David started taking Tommy to a child therapist who specialized in helping children of divorce. Dr. Martinez was a kind woman who used play therapy to help Tommy express his feelings about his changing family structure. She also gave David and me strategies for helping Tommy feel secure and loved, despite his mother's attempts to create instability. Children need consistency and predictability, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions. Tommy's living situation with you and his father provides that. His mother's visits, unfortunately, seemed to be creating anxiety rather than comfort. She recommended that we establish clear routines and boundaries around the visits, that we reassure Tommy consistently about the permanence of his living situation, and that we avoid speaking negatively about his mother while still validating his feelings about her behavior. One of the most difficult aspects of this period was watching Tommy struggle with his feelings about Stephanie. He loved her because she was his mother, but he was also beginning to recognize that her behavior toward me and sometimes toward him wasn't kind or appropriate. He was too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships, but old enough to sense when something wasn't right. During one visit, Stephanie had apparently told Tommy that if he really loved her, he would want to live with her instead of with his father and grandmother. When Tommy had expressed confusion about why he would have to choose, Stephanie had become upset and cut the visit short. That evening, Tommy crawled into my lap after dinner, tears streaming down his face. "Grandma Margaret, why does Mommy want me to not love you and Daddy?" he asked. The question pierced my heart. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that sometimes adults make poor choices? That love isn't supposed to be conditional or competitive? That wanting to live with someone doesn't mean you don't love someone else? "Tommy," I said carefully, "love isn't like pie, where if you give some to one person, there's less for everyone else. You can love your mommy and your daddy and me all at the same time, and none of that love takes away from the others." "But Mommy said if I loved her, I wouldn't want to live here with you." I took a deep breath, trying to find words that would be honest but age-appropriate. Sometimes when people are sad or angry, they say things that aren't quite right. Your mommy loves you very much, but she's also very sad about not living here anymore. Sometimes that sadness makes her say things that might confuse you. Are you sad that Mommy doesn't live here anymore? It was a complicated question. I wasn't sad that Stephanie was gone. The house was more peaceful without her constant criticism and manipulation. But I was sad that Tommy had to grow up with divorced parents. Sad that David's marriage had failed. Sad that a family had been broken apart. I'm sad that things didn't work out differently, I told him honestly. I'm sad that you have to visit your mommy instead of living with her. But I'm not sad about living here with you and your daddy. That makes me very happy. Tommy seemed satisfied with this answer, and he gradually relaxed in my arms. But I could see that these visits were taking an emotional toll on him, forcing him to navigate adult conflicts that he shouldn't have to handle. David was struggling with the same concerns. He wanted Tommy to have a relationship with his mother, but he was also seeing how these visits were affecting his son's emotional well-being. The supervised visitation was supposed to be temporary, contingent on Stephanie demonstrating appropriate behavior and emotional stability. But instead of improving, her interactions with Tommy seemed to be becoming more manipulative and emotionally charged. After 6 months of supervised visits, David's attorney petitioned the court to review the visitation arrangement. The supervisor's reports documented multiple incidents of inappropriate behavior, attempts to manipulate Tommy's loyalty, negative comments about David and me, and emotional responses that left Tommy distressed and confused. The judge was not pleased with these reports. During the review hearing, Stephanie was warned that her visitation rights could be further restricted if her behavior didn't improve. She was ordered to attend parenting classes and continue individual therapy, with the goal of learning appropriate boundaries and communication strategies for interacting with her son. Stephanie blamed everyone but herself for these restrictions. She accused David of coaching Tommy against her, accused me of poisoning the family against her, accused the court system of being biased toward fathers. She couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge that her own behavior was creating problems for her relationship with her son. Meanwhile, Tommy continued to flourish in our stable household. He started kindergarten that fall, and his teacher was impressed with his social skills, his emotional maturity, and his academic readiness. He'd learned to express his feelings verbally, to ask for help when he needed it, and to form positive relationships with other children and adults. Mrs. Patterson, his kindergarten teacher, commented during our first parent conference that Tommy seemed unusually secure and confident for a child from a divorced family. Many children in his situation struggle with anxiety or behavioral issues, she explained to David and me. But Tommy seems to have a very strong sense of family stability. He talks about both of you with obvious affection and trust. That feedback meant the world to me. Despite all the upheaval in Tommy's early years, despite the divorce and the custody battles and the difficult visits with his mother, he was growing into a happy, confident child who felt secure in his family's love. As Tommy's 5th birthday approached, I found myself reflecting on how much our lives had changed since that terrible day when I'd heard Stephanie call me a burden through the baby monitor. The pain of that moment had led to the best outcome possible for all of us. Tommy was thriving, David had learned to recognize and reject emotional manipulation, and I had rediscovered my own worth and independence. The birthday party we planned for Tommy was a celebration of our family's resilience and love. Unlike the awkward gatherings of previous years where I'd felt like an unwelcome servant, this party was a true collaboration between David and me. We invited Tommy's school friends, our neighbors, and my friends from the book club and community center. Watching Tommy blow out his candles, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this point. The road had been painful and difficult, but it had led us to a place of authentic love and mutual respect. That baby monitor had been the catalyst for profound change in all our lives. By accidentally revealing Stephanie's true feelings toward me, it had forced David to confront the reality of his marriage and make difficult but necessary choices for his family's well-being. It had given me the validation I needed to recognize that I deserved better treatment than I'd been accepting. Most importantly, it had protected Tommy from growing up in an environment where emotional manipulation and cruelty were normalized, where family members treated each other with conditional love and constant criticism. As I tucked Tommy into bed that night after his birthday party, he wrapped his arms around my neck and whispered, "Grandma Margaret, I'm glad you live with us forever." "I'm glad too, sweetheart," I whispered back. "I love you more than you can imagine." "I love you more than the whole world," he replied, using our special phrase. Lying in my own bed that night, I thought about the long journey from that painful afternoon in the kitchen to this moment of perfect contentment. That baby monitor had revealed more than just Stephanie's cruelty. It had revealed the strength of David's character, the resilience of Tommy's spirit, and my own capacity to demand the respect and love I deserved. Sometimes the most devastating moments in our lives are actually doorways to better circumstances. Without that accidental eavesdropping, I might have continued enduring Stephanie's emotional abuse for years. Tommy might have grown up learning that family love was conditional and manipulative, and David might never have recognized the true nature of his marriage. Instead, we'd all learned valuable lessons about self-worth, healthy relationships, and the true meaning of family loyalty. The baby monitor had been our unexpected guardian angel, protecting us from years of continued dysfunction and guiding us toward the authentic, loving family we'd become. The divorce was finalized 6 months ago, and while David admits he sometimes mourns the loss of the family structure he'd hoped to provide for Tommy, he says he's never regretted his decision to protect me from further emotional abuse. "Family means treating each other with love and respect," he told me recently. Stephanie forgot that, and I wasn't going to let her teach Tommy that it was acceptable to treat people that way. I'm grateful every day that David heard those cruel words through the baby monitor. If he hadn't, I might have continued enduring Stephanie's treatment, telling myself it was worth it for Tommy's sake. Instead, I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to refuse to accept being treated as less than you deserve. I still have that baby monitor, though Tommy is too old for naps now. Sometimes when I look at it, I remember how devastated I felt hearing Stephanie call me a burden. But I also remember that those same words led to David discovering who his wife really was underneath her false smiles and public gratitude. That monitor saved me from years of emotional abuse, gave Tommy a more honest family environment, and showed David that sometimes you have to choose between keeping peace and protecting the people you love. It was the best accidental eavesdropping of my life. Tommy is 5 now, and when people ask him about his family, he says he lives with Daddy and Grandma Margaret, and that Mommy visits sometimes. He talks about Rachel like she's already part of our family, and he's never once made me feel like I don't belong in his world. I'm 71 now, and I finally understand the difference between being tolerated and being treasured. I spent too many years accepting crumbs of appreciation from someone who saw my love as manipulation and my help as interference. Now I'm surrounded by people who value my presence, respect my contributions, and include me in their lives because they want me there, not because they feel obligated. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if David hadn't come home early that day, if he hadn't heard Stephanie's whispered cruelty through the baby monitor. Would I have found the courage to stand up for myself eventually? Or would I have continued accepting her treatment until she finally succeeded in pushing me out of their lives entirely? I prefer not to think about that alternate timeline. Instead, I focus on the beautiful life I have now, surrounded by people who see my age as wisdom rather than burden, my experience as valuable rather than outdated, and my love as a gift rather than an imposition. That baby monitor taught me that sometimes the most important conversations are the ones people think no one else can hear. In Stephanie's case, those words revealed her true character and saved me from years of continued emotional abuse. But they also revealed David's true character, his willingness to protect me, even when it meant sacrificing his marriage. I've learned that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about choosing to treat each other with kindness, respect, and love. Stephanie never understood that. But David did, and Tommy is learning it from watching how his father treats the people he cares about. The baby monitor sits in my bedside drawer now, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best outcomes. Without it, I might never have discovered that I deserved better than being called a burden by someone whose life I was making possible. These days, when people tell me how lucky David is to have such a helpful mother, I smile and thank them, but privately I know the truth. I'm the lucky one. Lucky to have a son who values me. Lucky to have a grandson who adores me. And lucky to have learned that sometimes the most important word you can learn to say is no. No to being treated with disrespect. No to accepting cruelty disguised as stress. No to believing that your worth is determined by other people's capacity to appreciate you. That baby monitor gave me back my voice, my dignity, and my family. Sometimes the most important messages are the ones we're not supposed to hear. Tommy turned 8 last month, and watching him blow out his candles surrounded by friends from school and neighbors who've become like extended family, I was struck by how different this celebration felt from those tense early birthdays when Stephanie still lived with us. There was genuine joy in our house now, authentic laughter that didn't carry undercurrents of criticism or walking on eggshells politeness. David has been dating Rachel, his kindergarten teacher, for almost 2 years now. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, beginning as conversations during parent-teacher conferences and school events. Rachel never tried to insert herself into our established routines or challenge my role in Tommy's life. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested in understanding our family dynamics and finding ways to contribute positively without disrupting what was already working well. The first time Rachel came to dinner, I was nervous about how Tommy would react to having another woman at our table. But she had a gift for connecting with children that went beyond her professional training. She asked Tommy about his favorite books, listened attentively to his elaborate explanations of his Lego constructions, and genuinely seemed to enjoy his company rather than tolerating it as an obligation. What impressed me most was how she treated me. There was no competition, no subtle attempts to establish herself as the primary female figure in the household. She asked for my advice about lesson plans, complimented my cooking without seeming to try too hard, and included me naturally in conversations, rather than focusing exclusively on David. Tommy warmed to her gradually, and I could see why. Rachel never tried to replace his mother or compete with me for his affection. She simply offered herself as another caring adult in his life, someone who enjoyed spending time with him and wanted to support his happiness and growth. The contrast with Stephanie's approach couldn't have been starker. Where Stephanie had seen my relationship with Tommy as competition to be minimized, Rachel seemed to view it as an asset that enriched Tommy's life. She often commented on how lucky Tommy was to have such a devoted grandmother, how rare it was for children to have that kind of consistent, unconditional love from an extended family member. David's relationship with Rachel also allowed me to see how partnership was supposed to work. They consulted each other about decisions, supported each other's individual interests, and treated each other with consistent kindness and respect. Tommy was witnessing what healthy adult relationships looked like, learning that love didn't have to involve manipulation, criticism, or emotional games. Stephanie's visits became increasingly infrequent over the years. The parenting classes and therapy requirements proved more challenging than she'd anticipated, and her commitment to maintaining a relationship with Tommy seemed to wane as the legal system demanded more accountability from her. Her last visit was almost 6 months ago, and even that had been cut short when she'd become frustrated with Tommy's reluctance to engage with her attempts to criticize his living situation. Tommy's feelings about his mother had evolved into something complex, but ultimately healthy. He understood that she was his biological mother and that he could love her, while also recognizing that her behavior wasn't always appropriate or kind. Dr. Martinez had helped him develop language for these complicated emotions, and he could now articulate that someone could love another person, but not enjoy spending time with them if that person made them feel bad about themselves or the people they cared about. The last conversation I had with Stephanie was almost a year ago, when she called the house directly instead of going through David's attorney as she was supposed to do. I answered the phone, not recognizing the California number, and was surprised to hear her voice on the other end. "Margaret," she said, and I could hear something different in her tone. Not the fake sweetness she'd used in public or the cold hostility she'd shown in private, but something that sounded almost like genuine emotion. "I've been thinking about calling you for months." I waited, unsure what to expect from this unexpected contact. "I want you to know that I never meant for things to get so bad between us," she continued. "I was young and stressed, and I felt like I was competing with you for my own place in my family. That wasn't fair to you." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever received from her, but it felt incomplete somehow. She was explaining her behavior rather than taking full responsibility for it. "Stephanie," I said carefully, "I appreciate you calling. I never wanted things to be difficult between us either." "I know Tommy is happy there with you and David," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I know he's better off with the stability you provide. I just want you to know that I don't blame you anymore for how things turned out." The phrase struck me as odd. She didn't blame me anymore, as if she'd previously held me responsible for the consequences of her own choices. But I also recognized that this phone call was probably difficult for her to make, and I didn't want to be unnecessarily cruel. "Tommy knows he's loved by everyone in his life," I told her. "That includes you, Stephanie. Whatever happened between us doesn't change the fact that you're his mother." "Thank you for saying that," she whispered. "Take care of him, Margaret." "I know you will, but I needed to say it." She hung up after that, and I never heard from her again. David's attorney informed us a few months later that Stephanie had officially relinquished her parental rights, signing papers that would allow Rachel to adopt Tommy if and when she and David decided to marry. Tommy took this news with the emotional maturity of someone much older than his 8 years. "Does this mean Stephanie doesn't want to be my mom anymore?" he asked David during one of their regular evening talks. David had struggled with how to explain this concept to a child. "It means she's decided that the best way for her to love you is to let other people take care of you full-time," he said finally. "Sometimes adults make decisions that are hard to understand, but we think she's trying to do what she believes is best for you. Will Rachel be my mom now? If you'd like her to be, and if she and I get married, then yes, she could legally become your mom. But that's a decision for all of us to make together." Tommy seemed satisfied with this explanation. A few weeks later, during one of our evening story sessions, he brought up the topic with me. "Grandma Margaret, do you think Rachel would be a good mom for me?" I considered the question seriously. Rachel had been part of our lives for 2 years now, and in all that time I'd never seen her be anything but patient, kind, and genuinely interested in Tommy's well-being. She'd never tried to undermine my relationship with him or compete for his affection. She treated him with the consistent respect and warmth that every child deserved. "I think Rachel would be a wonderful mom for you," I told him honestly. "She loves you very much, and she loves your daddy, and she treats all of us with kindness and respect." "She never says mean things about you like Stephanie used to," Tommy observed, demonstrating that he remembered more about those early years than I'd realized. "No, she doesn't. Rachel believes that families should be kind to each other, just like we do." David proposed to Rachel on Tommy's 9th birthday, right there in our backyard, with Tommy helping to present the ring. It was perfect and natural and exactly the kind of moment that our family specialized in now. Genuine joy shared openly without any hidden agendas or emotional manipulation. Tommy was thrilled to be part of the proposal, and Rachel's tearful acceptance included promises to both David and Tommy about the kind of stepmother and wife she intended to be. She also took my hands and promised to honor the special relationship I had with Tommy, to never try to replace me or minimize my importance in his life. The wedding is planned for next spring, a small ceremony in our backyard with Tommy serving as both ring bearer and best man. We've talked about having the reception in the garden, with tables scattered under the fruit trees David planted when Tommy was little. It will be a celebration of the family we've built together through adversity and choice, bound together by love and respect, rather than obligation or manipulation. I'm 73 now, and I wake up every morning grateful for the path that led me to this place. That baby monitor, which now sits in a drawer in my bedside table, changed all our lives in ways we never could have anticipated. What seemed like the most devastating moment of my older years turned out to be the beginning of the most fulfilling chapter of my life. Tommy still crawls into my lap sometimes when he's tired or upset, even though he's getting too big for it, really. He tells me about his day at school, his friends, his dreams for the future. He asks my opinion about things that matter to him, and listens to my advice with the attention of someone who trusts my judgment completely. I've learned that love multiplies rather than divides. Having Rachel join our family hasn't diminished my relationship with Tommy or David in any way. Instead, it's added another layer of security and happiness to our household. Tommy now has 3 adults who are completely committed to his well-being, who treat each other with kindness and respect, who demonstrate daily that family relationships should be sources of joy rather than stress. The community center where I volunteer has asked me to start a support group for older adults dealing with difficult family situations. Apparently, my story has become known locally as an example of how standing up for yourself can lead to positive changes, even when the initial confrontation seems devastating. I've spoken with several women my age who are struggling with manipulative adult children or in-laws, who've been made to feel unwelcome in families they've supported financially or emotionally for years. My advice to them is always the same. Your worth isn't determined by other people's capacity to appreciate you, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your dignity. The baby monitor taught me that sometimes the most important conversations are the ones people think no one else can hear. In Stephanie's case, those whispered words revealed her true character and freed all of us from a toxic situation that was damaging everyone involved, including her. But those same words also revealed David's character, his immediate willingness to protect me even at the cost of his marriage, his recognition that emotional abuse is unacceptable regardless of the justifications offered, his commitment to creating a home where family members treat each other with consistent love and respect. Tommy is learning these same values by watching how the adults in his life interact with each other. He's growing up understanding that love isn't conditional, that family relationships shouldn't involve walking on eggshells, and that standing up for people you care about is more important than avoiding conflict. Next month, Tommy starts 4th grade, and Rachel will officially become his stepmother. I'll continue living in the basement apartment that's become my perfect home, surrounded by people who value my presence and contributions. The garden David and I planted together flourishes in our backyard, just like our family has flourished after surviving the storm of those difficult early years. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if that baby monitor hadn't been in the kitchen that day, if David hadn't heard Stephanie's cruel assessment of my worth. Would I have found the courage to speak up eventually, or would I have continued accepting her treatment indefinitely? Would Tommy have grown up learning that family love was conditional and manipulative? I prefer not to dwell on those alternate possibilities. Instead, I focus on the beautiful life we've built together, the genuine love and respect that fills our home now, and the knowledge that sometimes our worst moments can become the catalysts for our best outcomes. That baby monitor sits in my drawer now, a reminder that truth has a way of revealing itself when we most need it to. It saved me from years of continued emotional abuse, protected Tommy from learning unhealthy relationship patterns, and gave David the clarity he needed to choose love over convenience. Every morning when I wake up in my comfortable room, when I hear Tommy's laughter echoing through the house, when I see David and Rachel treating each other with genuine affection and respect, I'm grateful for that accidental eavesdropping that changed everything. The baby monitor didn't just reveal Stephanie's cruelty, it revealed the possibility of something better, something authentic, something built on mutual respect, rather than manipulation and control. It gave all of us the chance to build the kind of family we actually wanted to be part of, rather than the one we'd been settling for out of obligation or fear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.